Hello everyone. Before we begin, take a moment to think about how quickly people judge someone based only on what they see. A dirty uniform, a mop, a tired face, and suddenly an entire life is reduced to a single assumption. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the biggest secret of all. On a cold Monday morning, the marble floors of the Jefferson County Courthouse reflected the pale sunlight that slipped through the enormous windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Lawyers rushed through security carrying expensive leather briefcases. Reporters gathered outside waiting for another high-profile corruption trial, and police officers stood watch as if nothing unusual could possibly happen that day. Near the entrance, an elderly janitor slowly pushed a cleaning cart across the polished hallway. Nobody looked at him twice. A few people stepped around him as though he were invisible. Moments later, another janitor appeared wearing the same gray uniform, the same worn work boots, and the same blue maintenance cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked younger, taller, and stronger than most of the maintenance staff, but there was something strangely calm about him. His name tag read Marcus Johnson. At least that was the name everyone believed. He quietly greeted the security guard with a polite smile before picking up a mop and beginning to clean the hallway leading toward Courtroom 7, where one of the city's most controversial criminal trials was about to begin. Inside the courtroom, television cameras were already setting up for limited media coverage. The defendant was a young black construction worker named Elijah Brooks, accused of assaulting a wealthy real estate developer during a contract dispute. Newspapers had already painted Elijah as another violent criminal from a troubled neighborhood. Very few people questioned the story because the victim, billionaire developer Richard Holloway, owned half the commercial buildings downtown and maintained powerful friendships with politicians, judges, and influential attorneys. The prosecution claimed the evidence was overwhelming. The defense insisted every piece of evidence had been manipulated. Nobody expected the truth to survive the day. Marcus quietly pushed his cleaning cart through the courtroom doors before the hearing officially started. Without saying a word, he began wiping fingerprints from the wooden railing beside the jury box. Several lawyers barely noticed him until Assistant District Attorney Stephen Collins looked up from his notes. Collins was famous for humiliating anyone he considered beneath him. He stared at Marcus with visible irritation before loudly saying that maintenance workers should know enough to stay out of serious legal proceedings. Several attorneys laughed. Marcus simply nodded and continued cleaning. Collins stood up and pointed toward the door. "Get out of here, now. This courtroom is for professionals." The latter grew louder. Even a few spectators smiled. Marcus calmly placed the cleaning cloth inside his cart before answering in a soft voice, "I only need 1 minute." Collins stepped closer, his face turning red with anger. "You need 0 minutes. Leave before security removes you." Marcus looked around the courtroom for just a moment. His eyes briefly met those of Judge Harold Whitmore sitting silently behind the bench. Something unexpected happened. For the smallest fraction of a second, the judge seemed to recognize him. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by a cold expression that revealed nothing. Marcus smiled politely. "I only came to watch today's hearing." Collins laughed louder than anyone else. "Watch. A janitor thinks he belongs in my courtroom." The audience joined him. Marcus lowered his eyes, apologized quietly, and pushed his cart toward the exit without another word. As he reached the hallway, he noticed Elijah's mother, sitting alone on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. She clutched a worn Bible so tightly that her hands trembled. Marcus stopped beside her and gently asked whether she was all right. She forced a weak smile and admitted she had already lost her husband years earlier, after he spent 2 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. Now she feared history was repeating itself with her son. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he simply placed a business card into her hand. The front of the card was completely blank except for one sentence: "Never stop believing the truth has a witness." Before she could ask another question, Marcus quietly walked away. Upstairs, inside a private office overlooking the courthouse parking lot, a man wearing an expensive Italian suit watched security footage from multiple cameras. One screen showed Marcus removing his janitor cap as soon as he entered a restricted maintenance corridor where no public cameras existed. Another showed him opening a locked storage room using a fingerprint scanner instead of a key. The suited man immediately picked up his phone. "Sir, he is here." The voice on the other end remained silent for several seconds before calmly asking the only question that mattered. "Did anyone recognize him?" The man answered no, although Judge Whitmore looked uncomfortable for a moment. Another pause followed. Then the mysterious voice quietly replied, "Good. Let them laugh. The higher their pride climbs today, the harder justice will make them fall tomorrow." The call ended. Meanwhile, Marcus entered a forgotten archive room hidden beneath the courthouse where thousands of dusty boxes filled old metal shelves. He walked directly toward a locked cabinet marked "Closed Records." Using another fingerprint scan, he opened the cabinet and removed a thick leather folder sealed nearly 25 years earlier. Inside lay photographs, sworn statements, financial records, and one faded videotape labeled "Evidence Never Presented." Marcus stared at the tape for several seconds before carefully placing everything into a plain black briefcase. As he closed the case, his expression changed for the first time all morning. The quiet smile disappeared. In its place stood a man carrying the weight of decades. People often mistake silence for weakness. They assume the person who lowers his head has already accepted defeat. What they never understand is that some people stay quiet because they know the truth does not need to shout to win. As the afternoon session began, courtroom 7 returned to its familiar rhythm. The jury settled into their seats, reporters adjusted their cameras, and Assistant District Attorney Stephen Collins walked confidently toward the center of the courtroom with the swagger of a man who believed victory had already been secured. Richard Holloway leaned comfortably against his chair, occasionally exchanging satisfied glances with his expensive legal team. Across the room, Elijah Brooks sat beside his exhausted defense attorney, trying to hide the fear growing behind his steady expression. His mother remained in the back row, clutching the worn Bible that had belonged to her late husband, silently praying that somehow history would not repeat itself. Standing quietly near the rear entrance, Marcus continued pushing his janitor cart across the polished marble floor as though nothing around him mattered. Several spectators barely noticed him. Others deliberately stepped aside without making eye contact. To everyone inside the courtroom, he remained exactly what they believed he was: another invisible maintenance worker, cleaning up after people who considered themselves more important. Collins cleared his throat before calling his final witness, a former construction supervisor named Daniel Reeves. The witness confidently testified that Elijah had threatened Richard Holloway several days before the alleged assault. He claimed Elijah had shouted that one day Holloway would pay for ruining working families. Every sentence sounded convincing. The jury listened carefully while several members nodded almost unconsciously. Collins smiled with growing confidence. This testimony completed the narrative he had carefully built since the trial began. He turned toward the jury and declared that violence driven by anger could never be excused regardless of circumstance. Before the defense could respond, Marcus quietly stopped mopping the floor. Without looking up, he checked the old silver watch resting beneath his sleeve. 2:43 in the afternoon, exactly on schedule. At that same moment, 3 black SUVs entered the underground parking garage beneath the courthouse. Men and women dressed in dark business suits stepped out carrying secure document cases. None of them wore police uniforms. None displayed courthouse identification. Yet every security checkpoint opened without hesitation as they approached. Upstairs, Collins continued questioning his witness, while the defense struggled to expose inconsistencies in the testimony. Daniel Reeves remained calm until the defense attorney asked one simple question: "Had anyone instructed you what to say before today's hearing?" Reeves immediately answered no, but tiny beads of sweat appeared across his forehead. Marcus noticed the change without lifting his eyes from the floor. He quietly resumed cleaning while pressing a hidden button beneath the handle of his mop. Hundreds of feet below the courtroom, another light illuminated inside the forgotten archive room. The restored videotape Marcus had recovered earlier continued playing frame by frame. Digital specialists enhanced the blurry footage until every face became unmistakably clear. Richard Holloway was seen handing an envelope filled with cash to the original prosecutor 25 years earlier. Moments later, Judge Harold Whitmore quietly entered the room through a side door never shown in official court records. The three men spoke briefly before several pieces of evidence were removed from a storage box. One technician paused the recording and enlarged the image. A faded evidence tag became perfectly readable. The number matched the same evidence file connected to David Johnson, Marcus's father. Upstairs, Whitmore felt his heartbeat quicken for reasons he could not explain. He looked toward Marcus once again. The janitor was no longer cleaning. He stood perfectly still beside his cart, watching the courtroom with calm patience. Their eyes met for only a second. Whitmore immediately looked away. A memory he had buried for decades suddenly resurfaced. 25 years earlier, another young black man had stood before him insisting he was innocent. Whitmore remembered ignoring missing evidence because powerful people had assured him everything was under control. That decision had destroyed one family forever. He had convinced himself the past would never return, yet the expression on Marcus's face made him realize the past had quietly walked back into his courtroom carrying nothing more threatening than a mop. Suddenly, the heavy wooden courtroom doors opened. Every conversation stopped. 3 federal investigators entered, followed by 2 forensic specialists carrying locked aluminum cases. Without speaking, they approached the court clerk and handed over sealed documents bearing the authorization of the United States Department of Justice. Collins frowned with obvious irritation. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses while reading the first page. The color slowly disappeared from his face. The courtroom remained completely silent. Whitmore looked toward the federal lead investigator, who calmly announced that newly recovered evidence connected to multiple criminal investigations required the immediate preservation of all records related to Richard Holloway and several individuals present inside the courtroom. Murmurs spread across the gallery. Reporters reached for their phones. Collins quickly objected, insisting every person in the courtroom stared at the black janitor as though the air had suddenly disappeared from the room. Only seconds earlier, he had been nothing more than an invisible maintenance worker pushing an old cleaning cart across polished marble floors. Now an attorney representing one of Chicago's largest real estate firms was addressing him with the respect usually reserved for billionaires. Marcus calmly placed the mop against the wall before removing a pair of worn work gloves. Beneath the stained uniform sleeves appeared the cuff of a perfectly tailored white dress shirt. He accepted the leather portfolio without rushing, quietly signed the final ownership documents, and handed them back with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. The attorney smiled politely before announcing that the transfer was complete and legally recorded with the county. Jefferson Plaza, including every courtroom, office, hallway, and lease within the building, officially belonged to Johnson Legacy Holdings. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Assistant District Attorney Stephen Collins looked from Marcus to the paperwork and back again, convinced there had to be some elaborate misunderstanding. Finally, he forced out an awkward laugh and said owning real estate had nothing to do with a criminal trial. Marcus looked toward him for the first time since entering the courtroom that morning. His voice remained soft, almost gentle. Normally it would not. Today is different. Collins frowned. Different how? Marcus answered without emotion. Because this building was purchased for one reason only: to make sure nobody destroys evidence ever again. Those words landed with far greater force than anyone expected. Judge Harold Whitmore tightened his grip on the edge of the bench. Richard Holloway slowly leaned forward in his chair, his confident smile fading into cautious concern. Marcus quietly reached into the inside pocket of his janitor jacket and removed a small silver key attached to an old leather tag. He placed it carefully on the evidence table. 25 years ago, he said, my father stood exactly where Elijah Brooks is sitting today. He begged this court to examine evidence proving he had been framed. That evidence disappeared before the jury ever saw it. Everyone believed it was lost forever. It wasn't. Reporters immediately began recording every word. Collins objected, insisting none of this had been disclosed before trial. Marcus calmly nodded. Of course it wasn't. The people responsible made sure of that. The federal investigator stepped forward and confirmed that an active investigation was now underway involving judicial corruption, evidence tampering, bribery, and conspiracies spanning more than 2 decades. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Elijah looked toward Marcus in complete disbelief while his mother slowly covered her mouth with trembling hands. Richard Holloway finally stood. His expensive suit no longer carried the confidence it had only minutes before. He demanded to know exactly who Marcus Johnson really was. Marcus looked directly into his eyes. My name is Marcus David Johnson. My father was David Johnson, the man your company destroyed 25 years ago. Holloway's face turned pale. The name clearly meant something to him. Collins looked between them, realizing for the first time that he had unknowingly walked into a battle that had begun long before he entered law school. Marcus continued speaking, his voice steady and controlled. My father spent 23 years, 7 months, and 12 days in prison for a crime he never committed. He lost his business. He lost his health. He lost my mother while he was behind bars because she couldn't afford the medical treatment she needed. He died 6 months after finally being released. The official apology arrived 1 week after his funeral. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the reporters forgot to type. Marcus reached into the cleaning cart and removed a faded photograph. It showed a smiling black father standing beside a young boy outside the same courthouse decades earlier. He handed the photograph to the judge. You sentenced an innocent man. Whitmore's hands began shaking. I didn't know, he whispered. Marcus answered quietly. You chose not to know. There is a difference. The words struck harder than any accusation Collins had ever heard inside a courtroom. Before anyone could respond, the federal investigators carried in a large evidence container sealed with Department of Justice markings. The lead investigator carefully opened the case and placed several restored files onto the evidence table. Financial records, original witness statements, surveillance photographs, internal company emails recovered from archived servers. Finally, the old videotape Marcus had discovered beneath the courthouse. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Richard Holloway had bribed multiple officials to secure illegal construction contracts. David Johnson had discovered the fraud and refused to participate. Days later, he became the perfect suspect in a fabricated assault case. Collins stared at the evidence in complete disbelief. He had built his career believing Richard Holloway represented success, influence, and respectability. Now every page revealed another carefully hidden crime. Holloway suddenly pushed back his chair and headed toward the courtroom exit. 2 federal agents immediately blocked his path. He protested loudly, claiming they had no warrant. The lead investigator calmly removed a folded document from his briefcase. The old man walked into the courtroom so slowly that every footstep echoed through the silence. His back was bent with age, his breathing was unsteady, and his hands trembled as though they were carrying the weight of an entire lifetime. Marcus stared at him without moving. 25 years of unanswered questions suddenly stood only a few feet away. Reporters lowered their cameras for the first time that day, sensing they were witnessing something far more important than another courtroom headline. The elderly man looked directly at Marcus, his tired eyes filling with tears before he managed to whisper a single sentence. I am sorry. I should have spoken years ago. Marcus remained silent. He had imagined this moment countless times while growing up without a father, while watching his mother work 3 jobs before illness claimed her life, while visiting prison on birthdays instead of celebrating them at home. He had dreamed about confronting every person responsible, but now that one of them stood before him, anger felt strangely empty. Federal agents escorted the old clerk to the witness stand. Judge Whitmore, visibly shaken, allowed the testimony to proceed despite knowing every word could destroy what remained of his career. The clerk introduced himself as Thomas Grayson, the former chief records officer of Jefferson County Courthouse. His voice cracked as he admitted that 25 years earlier he had personally removed evidence from David Johnson's case under direct orders from senior officials. Collins immediately objected, arguing that an unsupported confession carried little legal value. The lead federal investigator calmly slid another folder across the evidence table. Inside were decades of bank records showing monthly payments made to Grayson through a shell company secretly owned by Richard Holloway's corporation. The courtroom fell silent again. Grayson closed his eyes and nodded. Every payment was for my silence. Every month I accepted another check because I was too afraid to tell the truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. I kept one thing they never knew about. This opens safety deposit box 147 at First National Bank. Everything I couldn't live with is inside. Marcus accepted the key but said nothing. Grayson continued speaking through tears. The videotape you found is only the beginning. There are contracts, signed affidavits, original witness statements, photographs, and handwritten notes from your father. I hid them because I knew one day someone braver than me would come looking. Richard Holloway suddenly exploded with anger. From across the courtroom he shouted that Grayson was a liar trying to save himself. His outburst only made the situation worse. The lead investigator quietly informed him that the safety deposit box had already been secured under federal warrant earlier that morning. Holloway's face turned completely pale. For the first time all day, genuine fear replaced arrogance. Marcus looked toward him with calm eyes. My father used to tell me that lies are expensive. Every year you keep them alive, the interest gets higher. Today your bill finally came due. Before Holloway could respond, another figure unexpectedly entered the courtroom. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in an elegant dark suit, walked confidently toward the witness stand. Several executives sitting behind Holloway immediately recognized her. Rebecca Sloan, his chief legal counsel for nearly 15 years. Holloway stared at her in disbelief. Rebecca ignored him completely and handed a flash drive to the federal investigators. I would like to cooperate, she said quietly. Collins looked stunned. Rebecca had built one of the most successful legal careers in Chicago, defending powerful corporations. No one expected her to betray the man who had made her wealthy. She took a deep breath before explaining that 6 months earlier she had discovered internal company files proving Holloway had orchestrated evidence tampering, witness intimidation, judicial bribery, and fraudulent property acquisitions dating back more than 2 decades. She had secretly copied thousands of encrypted documents while deciding whether to come forward. Then 3 weeks ago she received an anonymous package containing only one photograph. It showed David Johnson standing beside his young son outside this very courthouse. On the back someone had written 4 words. Truth remembers every witness. Rebecca looked directly at Marcus. That was the moment I knew someone had survived long enough to finish what David Johnson started. Marcus offered only a slight nod. He had sent the photograph himself months earlier after discovering Rebecca had quietly refused to approve several illegal transactions inside Holloway Development. He had hoped there was still one honest person close enough to the conspiracy to help expose it. He had been right. Federal technicians immediately connected the flash drive to a secure forensic workstation. Thousands of emails appeared on the courtroom monitors. Payment schedules, secret meeting calendars, internal legal strategies designed to eliminate whistleblowers. One email froze everyone in place. It had been written only 8 months earlier. Subject line: prepare Elijah Brooks if necessary. Marcus slowly looked toward Elijah. The young construction worker stared back in confusion. The investigator opened the email. It described a contingency plan created after Elijah refused to approve falsified safety inspections on one of Holloway's construction sites. If persuasion fails, create liability through criminal exposure. Collins felt his stomach sink. Elijah had never been the result of bad luck. He had been selected long before the alleged assault ever happened. Marcus quietly walked toward Elijah and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They chose the wrong man, he said softly, because they forgot someone was already watching. At that exact moment, the message remained on Marcus's phone for only a few seconds before disappearing by itself. No number, no signature, no trace. He stared at the blank screen without showing the slightest reaction, but inside he understood exactly what it meant. Someone had been watching every move he made. Someone had known about the journal long before the federal investigation began. More importantly, someone powerful enough to bypass the security of Johnson Legacy Holdings was still operating from the shadows. The conspiracy had never belonged to Richard Holloway alone. He had simply been the face everyone was meant to blame when the truth finally surfaced. Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket and quietly asked the lead investigator not to announce the theft publicly. The investigator looked surprised. Marcus explained that whoever sent the message wanted him to panic. They expected every federal agency in the city to start chasing the journal while the real mastermind disappeared. That was exactly what he refused to let happen. Across the courtroom, Richard Holloway watched the conversation with growing curiosity. For the first time since his arrest, he smiled. It was not the confident smile of a billionaire certain he would escape prison. It was the smile of a man who suddenly realized someone even more dangerous was still protecting him. Marcus noticed the expression immediately. He walked toward Holloway until only a few feet separated them. "You know who took it, don't you?" Holloway laughed quietly. "You still think this story was about me?" Marcus remained silent. Holloway leaned closer and whispered, "I was never the king, Marcus. I was only allowed to sit on the throne." Those words sent a chill through everyone close enough to hear them. Before Marcus could ask another question, Holloway's attorney demanded that all communication stop. Federal marshals escorted Holloway out of the courtroom, but as he disappeared through the side entrance, he turned once more and calmly said, "If you want to know who destroyed your father, stop looking at businessmen. Start looking at the people who wear robes." The heavy steel door closed behind him. Marcus slowly looked toward Judge Harold Whitmore. The aging judge lowered his eyes, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. For the first time in his judicial career, he looked like an old man carrying unbearable regret instead of authority. 30 minutes later, the courtroom emptied as reporters flooded television stations with breaking news. Every major network interrupted regular programming. Billionaire Richard Holloway had been arrested. A decades-old corruption investigation had been reopened. A mysterious janitor had revealed himself as the owner of the courthouse building. Yet none of the news reports knew the most important detail. The real architect of the conspiracy remained free. That evening, Marcus drove alone through the rain toward Johnson Legacy headquarters. Police vehicles surrounded the building while forensic teams examined every floor. Nothing else had been disturbed. Computers worth millions of dollars remained untouched. Cash locked inside company vaults had not been taken. Only one object had disappeared: his father's leather journal. Marcus entered his office and quietly studied the empty display case where the journal had rested for years. Security footage played on a nearby monitor. At exactly 2:17 that afternoon, every camera inside the executive floor went black for 48 seconds. When the picture returned, the journal was gone. The intruder never appeared on screen. Whoever planned the theft understood the building's security system better than Marcus's own staff. His head of security apologized repeatedly, convinced he had failed. Marcus simply placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This wasn't your mistake. This was planned years before we ever met." As the investigation continued, an elderly receptionist approached Marcus, carrying a plain white envelope that had been delivered by hand only minutes earlier. There was no stamp, no address, only his name written neatly across the front. Inside lay a single black chess piece, a king along with another note. "Tonight, 10 o'clock, St. Andrews Station, come alone. Bring no badge, no lawyer, no federal agents. If you want the final truth, you will follow the same rules your father followed. Burn this note." Marcus stared at the chess piece for several seconds before quietly slipping it into his pocket. Only one person in the world would understand its meaning. Years ago, his father had taught him to play chess every Sunday afternoon. He always repeated the same lesson: never chase the king. Find the player moving the pieces. Marcus looked out the office window as darkness settled over Chicago. Rain covered the city skyline while distant thunder rolled across the lake. Without telling anyone where he was going, he changed out of the janitor uniform for the first time since the trial began. Instead of an expensive suit, he chose a simple black coat and dark jeans. He locked his office, walked past the worried federal agents waiting outside, and quietly drove toward the abandoned subway station mentioned in the letter. St. Andrew Station had been closed for nearly 15 years after a structural collapse flooded the lower tunnels. The city had sealed every public entrance, leaving only maintenance access beneath the old train platforms. At exactly 10 o'clock, Marcus stepped through the rusted gate, carrying nothing except a flashlight. The station was silent except for dripping water echoing through empty tunnels. His footsteps bounced off cracked concrete walls covered with faded graffiti. Then he heard another sound, slow applause. A single figure emerged from the darkness wearing a long charcoal overcoat. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He stood perfectly still before speaking in a calm voice that sounded strangely familiar. "You've grown into the man your father always hoped you would become." Marcus tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Who are you?" The stranger ignored the question. 25 years. The sound of the approaching train grew louder with every passing second, yet Marcus knew it was impossible. St. Andrew Station had been abandoned for 15 years. The tracks had been flooded, the tunnels sealed, and every electrical system disconnected long ago. Still, the vibration beneath his feet felt real. Dust fell from the cracked ceiling as brilliant white headlights slowly emerged from the darkness ahead. Marcus instinctively stepped backward, his eyes fixed on the impossible sight. The train rolled silently into the forgotten platform without a single passenger visible through its fogged windows. There was no route number, no transit authority logo, only a single silver emblem painted near the front carriage, a black chess king surrounded by a circle. The same piece that had arrived inside the anonymous envelope earlier that evening. The doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. No conductor appeared, no announcement echoed through the station. Then a familiar voice emerged from hidden speakers. "If you want the truth, get on the train. If you walk away now, you will never learn who truly destroyed your father." Marcus looked toward the tunnel where the mysterious man had disappeared only moments earlier, but the platform was empty. He understood the trap. Whoever orchestrated this meeting wanted him isolated. Federal agents would have no idea where he had gone. His phone displayed no signal. Every security camera in the station had been removed years ago. Logic told him to leave immediately. His father's memory told him something different. 25 years earlier, David Johnson had followed the evidence even when everyone warned him to stop. Marcus took a slow breath, stepped across the narrow gap, and entered the empty train. The doors closed behind him before he could change his mind. The train began moving almost silently through tunnels that should not have existed. Marcus walked cautiously through carriage after carriage, each one completely empty except for framed black and white photographs hanging above the seats. He stopped beside the first photograph. It showed Jefferson County Courthouse under construction nearly 40 years earlier. The second displayed Richard Holloway standing beside several city officials during the building's grand opening ceremony. The third photograph made Marcus freeze. His father stood smiling beside Judge Harold Whitmore, Richard Holloway, and another man whose face had been deliberately scratched away. Someone had removed only that one identity. Beneath the picture, a handwritten caption remained untouched. "Founding Committee, integrity above all." Marcus continued deeper into the train until he reached the final carriage. Waiting there sat an elderly woman dressed in a dark blue coat. Her silver hair rested neatly beneath a small hat. She appeared completely calm, as though she had been expecting him all evening. Before Marcus could speak, she gently smiled. "You look exactly like your father when he was your age." Marcus stared at her cautiously. "Do I know you?" She shook her head. "No, but your father trusted me with his life." Marcus remained standing. "Who are you?" The woman slowly reached into her handbag and removed an old courthouse identification badge. "Eleanor Hayes, former investigative reporter, former federal informant, former friend of your father." Marcus immediately recognized the name. Eleanor Hayes had vanished 23 years earlier after publishing several articles exposing government corruption. Official records claim she died in a house fire. She quietly laughed after seeing the surprise on Marcus's face. "They buried an empty coffin because it was easier than admitting they never found me." Marcus sat across from her as the train continued moving through darkness. Eleanor explained that David Johnson had uncovered something far larger than financial fraud. Holloway had simply been one businessman inside a network that secretly controlled judges, prosecutors, police officials, construction contracts, and political campaigns across the city. Whenever someone threatened to expose the organization, evidence disappeared, witnesses changed their stories, and careers ended overnight. Those who refused to stay silent often disappeared completely. Marcus listened without interrupting. He had suspected the conspiracy reached beyond Holloway, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had lived through it made the truth far heavier. Eleanor opened another leather folder and slid several photographs across the table. Every picture showed respected public figures attending private fundraising dinners together over the past 3 decades. Judges, senators, business executives, police commissioners, university presidents. One face immediately caught Marcus's attention: Stephen Collins. The same prosecutor who had mocked him only hours earlier. Collins appeared much younger in the photograph, standing beside Richard Holloway at a charity gala nearly 15 years earlier. Marcus frowned. Collins said he barely knew Holloway before this case. Eleanor nodded slowly. He lied. His father worked for the organization before him. His promotion was arranged long before he graduated from law school. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Collins had never been assigned to prosecute Elijah Brooks because of experience. He had been chosen because the outcome was already expected. Eleanor leaned forward. Your father discovered something even more dangerous than corruption. He discovered the organization's founder. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Who was it? Eleanor hesitated for several seconds. Because I tell you the name, there is no turning back. Marcus answered quietly. I crossed that line the day my father went to prison. Eleanor slowly removed one final photograph from the folder. Unlike the others, this image had been folded many times over the years. Marcus carefully opened it. His heartbeat immediately stopped. The photograph showed a group of men standing together inside Jefferson County Courthouse during its opening ceremony. Richard Holloway was there. Judge Whitmore was there. Thomas Grayson was there. Standing at the center with one hand resting proudly on the building's original blueprint was a distinguished man wearing a judicial robe and smiling confidently toward the camera. Marcus whispered the name before he even realized he had spoken. Chief Justice Edward Lancaster. Eleanor nodded. The most respected judge in Illinois. The man celebrated for fighting corruption was the one. Gunfire echoed through the abandoned tunnel with deafening force, each shot ricocheting off the concrete walls until it became impossible to tell where the attackers were hiding. Marcus instinctively pulled Eleanor Hayes behind one of the steel support columns, just as another bullet shattered the train window behind them. Glass exploded across the empty carriage. The emergency lights flickered weakly, bathing the station in an eerie red glow that made every shadow seem alive. Heavy footsteps approached from both ends of the platform. Whoever had planned the ambush knew there was nowhere to run. Eleanor's breathing became uneven as she reached inside her handbag and handed Marcus a small black flash drive. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained remarkably calm. If anything happens to me, this cannot fall into their hands. Marcus looked at the device for only a moment before slipping it inside his coat. How many are there? Eleanor quietly listened to the footsteps echoing through the tunnel. At least 6, maybe more. They never send fewer than that. Marcus glanced around the abandoned platform searching for another exit. Years earlier, the city had sealed every emergency passage after the station collapsed. The only visible path remained the tunnel itself, now occupied by armed men moving steadily closer. Suddenly, a bright flashlight beam swept across the platform. A deep voice echoed through the darkness. Marcus Johnson, this doesn't have to end tonight. Throw the flash drive onto the tracks and walk away. You still have a future. Marcus recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to the mysterious man who had stolen his father's journal. He remained hidden beyond the light, revealing nothing except calm confidence. Marcus answered without raising his voice. If you wanted the flash drive, you wouldn't have warned me. The stranger laughed quietly. Very good. You're beginning to think like your father. That's exactly why he had to die. Eleanor closed her eyes. Marcus felt her body tense beside him. She whispered almost silently, Don't let him make you angry. That's how they always win. Before Marcus could respond, another burst of gunfire erupted from the opposite side of the platform. Concrete splintered around them as several bullets struck the column protecting them. Marcus quickly guided Eleanor toward the rear maintenance corridor while keeping low beneath the broken train windows. They moved only a few feet before another voice shouted through the darkness, "Hold your fire." The order came with unmistakable authority. The gunfire stopped instantly. A tall figure slowly stepped into the dim emergency lighting. Expensive black shoes, perfectly tailored overcoat, silver hair, calm posture. As he removed his gloves, Marcus finally saw his face clearly for the first time. It was Chief Justice Edward Lancaster. The most respected legal figure in the entire state stood calmly inside an abandoned subway station surrounded by armed men. He looked nothing like a criminal. His expression carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to absolute control. Marcus stared at him without speaking. Lancaster smiled almost warmly. "I was hoping we could finally meet properly." Marcus answered coldly. "My father spent 23 years waiting for this conversation." Lancaster nodded with surprising sincerity. "Your father was one of the finest men I ever met." That statement ignited something inside Marcus. "You framed him." Lancaster slowly shook his head. "No. I gave him a choice. He refused to compromise. Men like your father make history, Marcus. Unfortunately, they rarely survive it." Eleanor stepped forward despite Marcus trying to stop her. "You murdered innocent people for power." Lancaster looked at her with genuine disappointment. "Eleanor, I gave you every opportunity to disappear quietly. Instead, you spent 2 decades chasing ghosts." She smiled bitterly. "They weren't ghosts. They were victims." Lancaster sighed as though the conversation exhausted him. Then he calmly raised one hand. Instantly, every armed man lowered his weapon. Marcus found the gesture unsettling. Lancaster clearly had no fear. He didn't believe force would be necessary. "I didn't bring you here to kill you," Lancaster said. "If I wanted that, it would have happened before you entered the station." Marcus remained silent. Lancaster continued walking until only a few feet separated them. "You're intelligent, disciplined, patient, just like David. That's why I have an offer. Leave this investigation. Walk away with your company. Build your father's legacy. I'll ensure Elijah Brooks is released. Richard Holloway will spend the rest of his life in prison. The public will believe justice was served. Everyone wins." Marcus almost smiled. "Everyone except the truth." Lancaster looked into Marcus's eyes for several long seconds. Then his expression changed. The warmth disappeared completely. "Your father gave me the same answer." Marcus quietly reached into his pocket and removed the old photograph showing the courthouse opening ceremony. He held it toward Lancaster. "There's one face missing from this picture. Someone scratched it out." "Why?" Lancaster glanced at the photograph without concern. "Because history always removes the people who write it." Marcus folded the photograph and slipped it back into his coat. "You're afraid of something." Lancaster laughed softly. "Afraid?" Marcus nodded. "Otherwise you wouldn't be standing here trying to negotiate. You would already have me arrested or dead." The Chief Justice's smile faded. For the first time that night, Marcus saw uncertainty in his eyes. Before Lancaster could answer, a loud explosion shook the far end of the tunnel. Bright tactical lights suddenly flooded the station. Voices shouted through powerful loudspeakers. "Federal agents, drop your weapons immediately." The armed men scattered in every direction. Lancaster looked genuinely surprised. He turned toward Marcus. "You brought them." Marcus calmly shook his head. "No, I trusted someone." Seconds later, dozens of heavily armed federal agents. Marcus read the sentence 3 times before carefully folding the letter and slipping it into the inside pocket of his coat. Around him, the abandoned subway station had become a maze of flashing emergency lights, federal agents, forensic investigators, and evidence technicians photographing every inch of the platform. Yet none of it mattered anymore. For 25 years, he had believed the answer to his father's fate was hidden somewhere inside a courtroom, a corporate office, or a forgotten evidence vault. Now David's own handwriting pointed somewhere completely unexpected. The cemetery. Marcus looked toward Eleanor Hayes, who sat wrapped in a thermal blanket while paramedics treated a small cut above her forehead. She watched him from across the platform and immediately understood what the letter meant. Without asking a single question, she quietly nodded. He knew this day would come, she whispered. Marcus walked over and handed her the note. She smiled sadly after reading it. Your father never trusted banks. He never trusted politicians. He barely trusted lawyers. But he trusted one place because nobody would ever think to disturb it, his own grave. The lead federal investigator approached them carrying a tablet filled with surveillance photographs recovered from the station. Chief Justice Edward Lancaster had escaped once again. Several of his men had been arrested, but none were willing to identify the organization they worked for. Every fingerprint belonged to former military contractors operating through shell companies. Every weapon had been purchased legally under different identities. Whoever Lancaster truly worked for had spent decades perfecting the art of disappearing. Marcus listened quietly before asking only one question. Was anyone following me before I entered the station? The investigator hesitated. Not that we could see. Marcus nodded slowly. Then Lancaster wanted me to escape. The investigator frowned. Why would he do that? Marcus looked back at the folded letter inside his pocket. Because he believes whatever my father hid has already been destroyed. He wanted me to stop searching. Early the following morning, before sunrise painted the Chicago skyline, Marcus drove alone toward Greenwood Memorial Cemetery on the western edge of the city. A thin layer of fog covered the rows of old gravestones while birds slowly filled the silent air with their morning songs. He carried no security team, no reporters, and no federal escort. Only Eleanor accompanied him, walking several steps behind with quiet respect. David Johnson's grave rested beneath a large oak tree overlooking a peaceful hill. The simple granite headstone carried only his name, his dates of birth and death, and a single sentence chosen by Marcus years earlier. The truth always outlives the lie. Marcus knelt beside the grave and gently brushed away fallen leaves that had gathered across the stone overnight. Memories flooded back without warning. His father teaching him chess on the front porch, his father laughing while fixing an old bicycle, his father waving through reinforced prison glass during visiting hours, pretending everything would be all right even though both of them knew it wasn't. Marcus closed his eyes for a long moment before opening the small wooden box containing fresh white lilies, his father's favorite flowers. As he placed them beside the headstone, something caught his attention. One corner of the granite base sat slightly higher than the rest. It looked almost intentional. Eleanor noticed it too. Your father built things carefully, she said softly. He never left mistakes behind. Marcus ran his fingers beneath the edge of the stone until they touched cold metal. Hidden beneath years of dirt rested a narrow steel compartment, no larger than a paperback book. There was no lock. Only a carved chess symbol matching the Black King still resting inside Marcus's coat pocket. He gently pressed the symbol. A quiet click echoed beneath the stone. The hidden compartment slowly opened. Inside rested a weatherproof metal case sealed in thick plastic. Marcus carefully lifted it out, his hands trembling despite every effort to remain calm. The case contained no money, no jewelry, no legal documents. Only dozens of cassette tapes, handwritten journals, photographs, and one envelope addressed in David Johnson's unmistakable handwriting. To my son. Marcus's breathing became uneven as he opened the letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained perfectly clear. My son, if you are reading this, it means they finally became afraid of the truth. That means I failed to protect our family, but I never stopped protecting the evidence. Trust no one whose power depends on silence. Not judges, not businessmen, not politicians. There is one person I could never identify. I only knew him by the name, the architect. He controlled everyone else. If you find him, the entire empire falls. Marcus looked up slowly. The architect. Eleanor closed her eyes. I prayed your father was wrong about that name. Marcus continued reading. The letter explained that years before his arrest, David had secretly recorded every meeting with members of the corruption network using miniature audio recorders hidden inside his briefcase. Every cassette inside the metal box contained conversations proving bribery, judicial interference, election fraud, and illegal construction deals reaching far beyond Chicago. Marcus immediately understood why Lancaster had tried so desperately to recover the journal. The journal had been a distraction. The real evidence had been resting beneath David Johnson's grave for a quarter of a century. Suddenly, the peaceful silence of the cemetery was shattered by the distant sound of helicopter blades. Marcus instinctively looked toward the sky. A black helicopter circled once above the cemetery before turning sharply toward the hill where they stood. At the same moment, 3 black SUVs burst through the cemetery gates, racing across the narrow gravel road directly toward David's grave. Eleanor's face turned pale. Marcus quickly sealed the evidence case and grabbed the metal handle. The lead SUV skidded to a stop less than 50 yards away. Armed men wearing... Marcus tightened his grip on the weatherproof metal case as the armed men spread across the cemetery with disciplined precision. They moved like soldiers who had rehearsed the same operation dozens of times, never raising their voices, never wasting a single step. The morning fog rolled across the hillside, partially hiding their movements while the black helicopter circled lower overhead, its powerful rotors bending the branches of the old oak tree above David Johnson's grave. Eleanor Hayes quietly stepped beside Marcus, refusing to retreat despite the danger. One of the men carrying the loudspeaker slowly removed his tactical helmet. He appeared to be in his early 50s with gray hair, calm blue eyes, and the posture of a retired military officer. His expression carried neither hatred nor anger. It was the face of a man convinced he was simply doing his job. He introduced himself without hesitation. "My name is Colonel Nathan Briggs. I don't enjoy violence, Mr. Johnson. I would prefer we settle this peacefully." Marcus remained silent. Briggs looked toward the grave before speaking again. "Your father was offered the same opportunity many years ago. He made the wrong decision." Marcus answered quietly. "My father made the only decision he could live with." Briggs smiled faintly. "Unfortunately, he didn't live very long afterward." The words hung in the cold morning air. Marcus felt anger rising inside him, but he remembered Eleanor's warning from the subway station. They wanted emotion. Emotion created mistakes. He forced himself to remain calm. "You aren't here for the evidence," Marcus said. "You're here because you're afraid of what's on those tapes." Briggs shook his head. "No, I'm here because you're looking in the wrong direction. The architect doesn't fear evidence. He owns the people who investigate evidence. He owns the people who write the laws. He owns the people who decide which truths deserve to survive." Marcus looked directly into Briggs's eyes. "Then why are you carrying rifles instead of lawyers?" For the first time, Briggs laughed. "Because lawyers are slower." Before anyone could move another inch, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the cemetery. Federal vehicles raced toward the main entrance from 3 different directions. Briggs glanced toward the road without the slightest concern. "You're exactly on time," he said quietly. Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" Briggs slowly stepped aside and gestured toward the approaching convoy. "Watch carefully." The first black SUV belonging to the Department of Justice stopped only a few yards away. Federal agents poured from the vehicles with weapons drawn. The lead investigator Marcus had trusted since the courthouse investigation immediately ordered Briggs and his men to surrender. For several tense seconds, neither side moved. Then something impossible happened. The federal investigator lowered his weapon. Briggs calmly walked forward and extended his hand. The 2 men shook hands like old colleagues meeting after years apart. Marcus felt the ground disappear beneath him. Eleanor whispered only one sentence: "They were never coming to save us." Briggs turned back toward Marcus with visible disappointment. "Trust is a dangerous luxury, Mr. Johnson, especially when you place it in institutions your father already proved were compromised." The lead federal investigator removed his badge, placed it into his pocket, and calmly addressed Marcus. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way." Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Every briefing, every investigation, every arrest, was all of it staged? The investigator lowered his eyes. "Not all of it. Richard Holloway was sacrificed because he became a liability. Chief Justice Lancaster has served his purpose. Every organization survives by removing pieces that become too visible." Marcus finally understood the true scale of the conspiracy. Holloway had never been protected. He had been expendable. Lancaster was no longer the man in control. Even the federal investigation itself had been carefully guided toward exposing only those whose usefulness had ended. Briggs slowly walked closer until only a few feet separated them. "Give me the case, Marcus. The people inside these tapes are mostly dead. The ones still alive have already been replaced. You cannot destroy a machine by proving who built the first version." Marcus looked down at the metal case resting in his hands. His father had hidden it beneath his own grave, believing one day it would expose the entire organization. Yet standing before him now was proof that the organization had evolved far beyond the evidence inside the box. Eleanor suddenly stepped forward. "You're wrong, Colonel." Briggs looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Am I?" She smiled for the first time that morning. David never trusted one hiding place. Briggs's expression changed instantly. Marcus understood before anyone else. The metal case had never been the real weapon. His father had expected someone to find it eventually, which meant the true evidence had to be somewhere else. Briggs saw the realization appear in Marcus's eyes. His calm confidence vanished for the first time. "Where is it?" Briggs demanded. Marcus slowly closed the case and smiled. "I was hoping you would tell me." Briggs immediately raised his pistol. Every armed man around the cemetery followed his example. At that exact moment, Marcus remembered something his father had written years earlier. "Trust no one whose power depends on silence." He also remembered something David used to say every Sunday while teaching chess. "The smartest move is the one your opponent forces you to make." Marcus looked toward his father's headstone again. The lilies he had placed there only minutes earlier had shifted slightly in the wind. Beneath them, carved almost invisibly into the lower corner of the granite, rested another tiny chess symbol he had completely overlooked. It was different from the first one. Instead of a king, it showed a pawn. Marcus suddenly laughed. Briggs frowned. "What's so funny?" Marcus looked back at him with complete confidence. "You spent 25 years protecting the wrong secret." Before Briggs could react, Marcus reached down, not toward the metal case, but toward the base of the headstone itself. His fingers pressed the tiny carved pawn. A deep mechanical click echoed beneath the earth. Everyone froze. Slowly, almost silently, another hidden compartment began opening beneath David Johnson's grave. Briggs's face lost all color. He whispered a single word that revealed more fear than Marcus had seen in anyone since this investigation began. Colonel Nathan Briggs instinctively took one step backward as the hidden compartment beneath David Johnson's grave slowly emerged from the ground with the sound of rusted gears that had remained untouched for more than 25 years. Every armed man surrounding the hillside tightened his grip on his weapon, but no one fired. Even the helicopter circling above seemed to pause, as though the entire world had stopped to witness whatever David Johnson had hidden beneath his own grave. Marcus knelt beside the opening compartment while keeping his eyes fixed on Briggs. The seasoned officer who had appeared so calm only moments earlier now looked genuinely unsettled. That single reaction told Marcus everything he needed to know. Whatever lay inside the second compartment was something the organization had searched for unsuccessfully for decades. The small steel container finally locked into place above the ground. It was far smaller than the first one, barely large enough to hold a single envelope. Marcus slowly opened the lid. Inside rested an ordinary cassette tape, a silver pocket watch, and a folded handwritten letter sealed with dark blue wax. Nothing more. Briggs lowered his pistol slightly, confused by the simplicity of the contents. Marcus carefully picked up the letter first. Across the front, written in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were only 5 words. "Open this in public only." Marcus stared at the message for several seconds before placing the unopened letter inside his coat. Briggs immediately realized his mistake. Whatever the letter contained was never meant to be read in secret. David Johnson had planned for it to become public. Briggs stepped forward. "Give me the envelope." Marcus calmly shook his head. "No." Briggs raised his pistol again. "You have no idea what you're carrying." Marcus smiled faintly. "Neither do you." For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, uncertainty spread through Briggs's men. They had expected documents, money, or digital files. Instead, they faced a sealed letter capable of terrifying an organization that controlled judges, prosecutors, and billion-dollar corporations. Eleanor quietly picked up the silver pocket watch resting beside the cassette tape. As she opened its cover, she gasped softly. Hidden beneath the glass was a tiny photograph of David Johnson standing beside another man whose face Marcus had never seen before. The stranger wore no uniform, no judicial robe, and no expensive suit. Yet everyone else in the picture looked toward him with obvious respect. On the inside cover, David had engraved one sentence: "The architect never leads from the front." Marcus took the watch from Eleanor and studied the unfamiliar face. Briggs noticed the photograph immediately. His expression hardened. "Destroy the watch," he ordered. 2 gunmen rushed forward. Before they could reach Marcus, the sound of another convoy echoed through the cemetery. This time it was different. Not federal vehicles, not police. Nearly 20 news vans burst through the cemetery gates, followed by local reporters carrying cameras and broadcasting equipment. Helicopters belonging to national television networks appeared overhead within seconds. Briggs looked stunned. Marcus calmly reached into his pocket and removed his phone. Earlier that morning, before coming to the cemetery, he had scheduled an encrypted message to every major news organization in Chicago. If he failed to cancel it by 8 o'clock, reporters would automatically receive the exact GPS location of David Johnson's grave along with one sentence: "The truth will finally be uncovered here today." Briggs slowly lowered his head. "Clever." Marcus answered quietly. "My father taught me that sunlight is stronger than bullets." Cameras surrounded the hillside within moments. Reporters began broadcasting live as armed men wearing unmarked tactical uniforms suddenly found themselves standing in front of millions of viewers across the country. Briggs understood immediately that any violent action would be witnessed in real time. He quietly signaled his men to lower their weapons. The organization had survived for decades by operating in darkness. Live television was the last battlefield they wanted. Marcus walked toward the microphones without fear. He held up the sealed envelope, but made no attempt to open it. Instead, he looked directly into the nearest television camera. 25 years ago, my father was called a criminal because powerful people believed they could bury the truth forever. Today I am standing where he was buried to tell every family who has ever lost someone to corruption, lies, or abuse of power that the truth does not disappear. It waits. The reporters fell completely silent. Marcus continued. This letter will be opened during a public federal hearing where every citizen can watch without edits, without secret meetings, and without closed doors. Whatever is inside belongs to the people, not to me. Briggs watched from a distance, realizing the battle had already shifted beyond his control. Killing Marcus now would only confirm every accusation. Taking the letter by force would be broadcast across every news channel in America. For the first time in decades, the organization had been dragged into the light before it could prepare its response. As journalists continued filming, Marcus finally picked up the old cassette tape. There was no label except one handwritten sentence: "Play only after the letter." Eleanor looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Your father planned every step." Marcus nodded slowly. He wasn't hiding from them. He was leading them exactly where he wanted. Just then Marcus's phone vibrated. An unknown number. One new message appeared on the screen. "Congratulations, you finally found David's first message." Marcus's heartbeat slowed as he read the second line. "The architect smiled while watching your interview." Then came the final sentence that sent a chill through his entire body. "If you want to meet me, I'll be sitting in the front row when you open the letter." Marcus slowly looked across the growing crowd of reporters, police officers, grieving families, and curious spectators gathering around the cemetery. Hundreds of faces stared back at him. Somewhere among them stood the most powerful and dangerous person he had spent 25 years searching for, calmly watching the entire scene unfold, waiting for the next move in a game that had begun long before Marcus was born.